Good morning. For those of you that are in the room and also those who are online watching, this is our second day of the Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board meeting here in Sacramento. What I'd like to do maybe is, for those, we might have some new people online or new people in the audience here. So with Dr. McDonald, we'd like to go down the room and make a very short introduction and where you're from. You have to do it again. Can you bring?
It takes a couple of seconds for the sound audio.
Good morning, Sue McDonald from Kennett Square, Pennsylvania.
June Suing from Cedar City, Utah.
My name's Cope from Salmon, Idaho.
Boyd Spratling from Death, Nevada.
Greg Shoup, BLM, Washington, D.C. Rick Danver, Casper, Wyoming.
Callie Hendrickson, Grand Junction, Colorado.
John Fallon, Northern Nevada rancher.
Tim Harvey, New Hampshire, from Humane Advocacy.
And I'm Dean Bolstad, BLM, Washington office.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, we're gonna move into all morning. We'll have some interesting updates on things that are happening. Everything from research and studies on population surveys to shade research and responses to hot weather and thermal profile assessments. So we'll start out this morning with Paul Griffin from the U.S. Geological Survey out of Fort Collins, Colorado, and he'll be discussing population surveys. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning.
I'd like to introduce Paul briefly.
Sure, sure.
That's fine. We've spoke about the interagency agreement that BLM entered into with United States Geological Survey. Paul was hired specifically to be that technical expertise to assist us. I don't have Paul's bio and all his background, but I assure you he is very capable. Our field people love him and are so enthusiastic to work with him, and he is such a high-energy person. He has helped us exceed the goals and expectations for this year's surveys to be conducted with these USGS recommended survey methods that he's going to talk about. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Paul and indicate my excitement that we have his assistance. So Paul, take her away, please.
Thank you, Dean. I'm not sure I'm as good on this seat as I am in a helicopter, but I'll try do my best. Well, just first by way of background about myself, you know, for years I've known that wild horses and burros, they kind of represent a lot of things to a lot of people, and they have attributes that many of us in America identify with. You know, they're strong, they're resilient, they occupy beautiful country, they remind us of our history, coming across great open landscapes.
Can we have you speak up just a little bit? I think it's not, we'll get you a little louder if we can. So.
I'll be louder on the aspects of survey work. But I've been reflecting about how horses and burros mean so much to so many people. They remind us of our history and have a lot of attributes that remind us of pioneers coming across the West. And they're strong, they're resilient, and of course they're very fertile, so as many of our ancestors were. So when I was applying for this position to work on surveys, I thought of my great-grandfather who came over from Italy and drove a mule team from San Francisco to Virginia City many times till he realized that there were other callings for him, so he left his mule team behind. And sometimes I imagine that his mules, you know, he probably turned them loose, but I know that those descendants aren't out there because they were mules. So anyway, that's about as romantic as I'll ever get about horses and burros, because my position is really strictly to help with the estimation of population size. And so for whatever qualities horses and burros have, we are fortunate that they demographically and in many ways, they're like so many other wildlife species. So we can learn from many lessons of other aerial surveys conducted for wildlife to improve the quality and the accuracy and the precision of surveys for horses and burros. So really, I feel very lucky to have this job that I do, because I think everybody can agree from no matter what you'd like to see done with management of horses and burros on public lands, I think we can all agree that the first step for making management decisions is knowing how many horses are there in each HMA, wild horse territory, or other areas. Before I go into my talk, though, I would like to acknowledge all the help and support that I've had in this position I just started in December from the Washington office, especially B. Wade, who I don't think is here in these meetings, but she's my key liaison as we arrange logistics, and the other staff in the USGS Wild Horse and Burro Research Program, including Kate Schonecker and Butch Rowley, and of course my wife Sue, who is very supportive despite me being away for a lot of surveys and taking care of our home. So today, where should I point this? Okay. This is what I'd like to talk about this morning, these 5 topics. First, why is the USGS here? Why is the Geological Survey here at all? These are BLM and Forest Service issues generally. Next, what guidelines from the National Academy of Sciences report relative to aerial surveys can be improved on, and how is the USGS helping the BLM and Forest Service to make those improvements? I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2 methods that have been approved in the sense that they've been tested scientifically for their accuracy and precision for use in aerial survey. And in that, I'll do a little digression and just sharing a hint of how that analysis happens so that you can understand what the methods are. I'll talk about what's the process that we have going now for deciding how to go about surveys, what happens with data collection, and what happens with data storage, another National Academy's recommendation. And then finally, I'll touch briefly on some of the survey-related research that we have in the works or will be proposing soon at the USGS. Okay, so first, whoa.
We both did it.
Oh, okay. I think I've got it here. So why the U.S. Geological Survey? Well, the U.S. Geological Survey, or USGS, is the research branch for the Department of Interior. So not only are there divisions within the USGS for mineralogy, volcanology, water resources, but there's also an ecosystems division. For historical reasons, this is why I can't get into why it's all called the USGS, but there's a wildlife group within the ecosystems division of the USGS, and we're responsive to any time that a Department of Interior agency contacts and would like help with impartial research. The Horse and Burro group at USGS, based in Fort Collins, has been working on research related to horses and burros since 1993, when Dr. Francis Singer started to get involved. And there was it includes a number of years of working on, specifically on aerial survey methods for horses. The one reason that the other agencies in Department of Interior come to USGS is because we are impartial. We have our own peer review process in addition to external peer reviews. And we're not involved in any management decisions. So we have a history of just, essentially everybody's on the staff. Most people on the staff have PhDs, and our role is just to do science. I think I want to go forward, not backward.
The middle one.
Thank you. More specifically, USGS has been involved since the 1990s on wild horse and burro science. And in 2000, Dr. Singer drafted the first strategic research plan for wild horse research. That was followed up with early PZP field trials, and of course PZP is in use widely now. Starting in 2004, Jason Ransom began his work looking at different methods that would be appropriate for aerial surveys for horses and burros. And he continued for several years. He just recently left the USGS in the last couple of years. He's working at the Park Service now. And I just want to point out that all or almost all of the research done to date on wild horse and burros is appropriated directly and to the USGS. So with the exception of, there's one study that is recently approved to assess the long-term effectiveness of SPAVAC as a fertility control method. And also my position, as Dean talked about, there's an agreement between the BLM and the USGS that funds my position.
Paul, can I ask a question right at that point?
Sure.
Just to reiterate, to clarify, it's not coming in, the pie chart budget that we looked at yesterday, the majority of your research, other than SPAVAC, and part of your position would not be coming out of the BLM horse and burro budget, correct?
No, that's not correct. BLM is providing funds to USGS
For this
the
research.
For Paul's population survey expertise,
Okay.
and also all the research projects that I mentioned will be undertaking in the future with USGS, or plan to. Those will be funded with BLM funds. USGS budget is about $200,000, as they tell me, for research work from
Okay,
their
that's what you were
agency.
saying yesterday, and that's why I was a little confused by looking at this. It makes me,
You
leads
know-
me to believe that,
I should clarify that this is at the moment.
Okay.
But I didn't mean to mislead anybody. We will be applying for additional research support from BLM.
okay.
Under the agreement that I'm hired under, well, the position was created and then I applied for and got. The main purposes are for me to help to train the BLM staff in the field in using proper survey methods for these two methods that have been approved, and then any others that we develop down the road. Develop a survey training manual and a very consistent workflow for how surveys are approached. Help talk with each district and help select the right method for their circumstances for aerial survey in that place, in that one HMA or complex. And then help to collect those data if the people in the field need help. Help them to collate the data and get it ready for the statistician. Bring it over to the statistician. His name is Bruce Lubo. He's been working on these analyses for a number of years, and he's also based in Fort Collins. Help to develop future methods of survey, and then I also do a review of Bruce Lubo's work. So when he has analyzed data, I review his memos that are going back to the district, and we talk about the results. We ask the question of what could be done different or better next time, and so we view it all as, at least from here on forward, trying to improve, get it right now, and then see where there's room for improvements. So under the agreement that I'm hired, it's a $450,000 agreement over 3 years. That includes my salary and travel and overhead. And there's a Forest Service to USGS agreement that's also in the works. And if that is approved, then that will also mean that Forest Service wild horse territories will all have the same survey methods and treatment and workflow and data handling as BLM lands. So, you know, the horses don't make the distinction between jurisdiction, and so from a record keeping and estimation point of view, we'd like not to make that distinction either. Specifically this year, when I first started in December, I was looking forward to a very relaxed year because I was told that there wouldn't be very many surveys. There wouldn't be any money this year for surveys, and just a few with leftover money. But it's very exciting that this year, actually, there's a large number of aerial surveys planned. So my calendar's pretty full. And so far, we've done trainings with staff in Oregon, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. And starting in February, we have had surveys in Nevada, Oregon, and Wyoming, with many more coming up. So we've surveyed 20 HMAs so far with aerial surveys, and then there are about 60 plus more planned for the rest of this year. Of the 86 surveys that are planned, 5 are ground counts, and I'm not so far getting involved with those. Those use a different method. So what are the really key methods or key changes that the National Academies recommended to the aerial survey program? Well, I have 2 really highlighted and 3 others that are very intuitive anyway. The first 2 are use a method that accounts for the animals that don't get seen by direct counts only. So the background is historically, it was very common for people to get in their helicopter or airplane, go to the areas where they expected to see horses, count the number of horses there, and then conclude that that's how many horses were in the HMA. So, and then they would often add a kind of a somewhat arbitrary additional percentage of how many horses they expected that they missed. So rather than that direct count method, what is recommended now is do your surveys in a way that allows you to estimate how many horses were missed statistically, not just kind of in a ad hoc fashion. The second big recommendation was to manage the data that get collected in a way that's more consistent and retrievable into the future. If you're going to spend $100,000 on a survey in a large area, that's valuable data. You don't want it to be lost in an obscure computer system down the road. So let's make sure that those get taken care of and can be referred to down the line. There's some other recommendations that I'm not going to really go into how we're making those changes today, but they include when you're going to do an aerial survey of an HMA, cover the whole thing. And if your population of horses is using lands outside of the HMA boundaries, you should survey those areas too. Second would be when you have HMAs or herd areas where there's horses and the horses can move back and forth, and you should survey those HMAs at the same time. And the last thing is for long-term assessment of trends and knowing how is the population changing over time, it makes a lot of sense to repeat your surveys year after year after year at the same time of year so that you can compare apples to apples. So of those guidelines, I want to talk about the first one here. How do we estimate the number of horses that don't get seen in surveys? How do you count what you don't see? And in wildlife biology, this is related to a concept we call detection bias. The idea is what percentage or how many of the animals that you're counting go unseen. And so what I'm suggesting on this graph is I have the number of horses that might get counted in a survey on the y-axis, and then I have the, let's say, time. Let's say you're doing a whole lot of surveys over time, year after year after year after year, and the x-axis. Well, let's imagine that you do direct counts, and so this dashed line is how many horses you counted. If you had some way to know at the very start what additional percentage of horses were missed, for example, let's say you had a whole lot of branded geldings, and you could count them, and we saw 80 out of 100 branded geldings, so I'm going to say that we missed 20% of the horses that were out there. You might say, all right, we missed 20%, I'm going to add 20% extra. And moving forward in time, you might hope that same 20% applies throughout time into the future. And if you were right, then then there would be a consistent detection bias, and you could always adjust your counts. But the problem is that unless you have a way to count that detection bias over time, it might change, and you might not know that. You might just keep on counting animals. You might hear what I'm suggesting in this cartoon is maybe the number of animals you count keeps going down, but in fact, the number of horses that are present doesn't change that much. And this could happen just from other attributes of horse behavior. They could be going into the trees more. They might be occurring in smaller group sizes, which are generally more difficult to detect from the air. So there's all sorts of reasons that detection bias can shift over time, and we need a way to account for it every time we go out to survey. So how do we do that? Well, there's two methods that I'm going to talk about, but for both of them, and these are both forms of what we call mark recite or mark recapture analyses. And in both cases, the idea is you go out and you do your aerial survey, you observe some horse groups, all that you can find. Do it in a systematic way, though. For each horse group that gets seen in the survey, we estimate the probability that that horse group would have been detected if we did repeat surveys. How likely is it that we saw that group? Of course, it's in our data set, so we know we saw it this time, but what if we came back next time? What would be the probability of seeing that same horse group in the same circumstances, the same group size, the same vegetative cover, the same side of the airplane or helicopter? What are the chances that we would see that same group again? And then, having that probability, we correct and we estimate the number of horse groups that were out there like that one that we didn't see. So we saw one, we got the probability of seeing that if we do a repeat survey, and then it represents a certain number of unseen groups that were also out there. So that's the key assumption. That's the statistical method underlying the work for both these methods. Okay, the first method that I'm going to talk about is called simultaneous double count. And this is an appropriate method in cases where the visibility of horses is pretty good, not too much cover in terms of trees, and it's best done in areas where we can have a large data set. So more than 50 observations of horse groups is good. But it can be used even in small HMAs where there's small horse groups, small number of horses, because you can use data from year to year to year to year and build up a bigger data set. Essentially, the bigger your data set is, the better you are at being able to estimate the probability of detection for horse groups that you see. This method was validated by the USGS with horses in Colorado, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming by Jason Ransom and company, and for burros in work in Arizona. So, and when I say it's validated, what I mean is that aerial surveys were done. The method was, this analytical method was used to estimate what's the population size, and the estimate was compared against the true population size, where the true population size was known either because people were on the ground doing ground counts of individually known animals, or there were surveys before and after a gather, so the number of animals turned back was known. Various methods, but the point is that the estimates were compared against truth, and they were found to be sufficient. Okay, so here's how it works in practice. And I'm going to spare you all having to put in earplugs and put on a helicopter helmet and spin around in a helicopter for this. But what we do is, what we're collecting is what's called double observer data. Essentially, there's 4 people in the helicopter or airplane, but the pilot and the front seat observer are considered kind of one observing team, and the back seat observers are considered a different observing team. And while you're flying, Nobody gives clues to each other about horse groups that they see until everybody in the helicopter has had a chance to see them. So what we're doing is, even though we're all flying in one helicopter, we're treating it as if it's two separate surveys. One survey conducted by the front seat passengers and one by the back seat passengers. And in that way, we're getting this mark recapture data. It's like if a horse group was seen by the front seat passengers, it's kind of like they were marked. And if that same group was seen by the back seat passengers, it's kind of like they were recaptured. So we use this to get the probabilities of detection. So at the end of the day, when we land, the horse groups that are in the data set, they were either seen by just the front seat, just the back seat, or some of them by the front and back seat. And of course, what we want to estimate is how many horse groups were out there that were seen by neither front nor back. This is kind of how it looks. It's kind of a cartoon of what's going on. At this point, the helicopter's flying. There's a group of 3 horses, and the front seat passengers might have detected these horses, but they shouldn't say anything yet because the back seat passengers, whose views I'm suggesting with this kind of purpley color up here and yellow down there, they haven't had a chance to see the horses yet. You keep on flying straight, and by this point, the horses are past. The back seat has definitely had their chance to see those horses, and whoever has seen them now can speak up and say, "Hey, did you see those horses? Yeah, okay, 9 o'clock, I got them off on the left. Let's circle back. Let's count them. Maybe I see 3, but maybe there's more." So at this point, everybody works together to collect complete data. It's only in that detection process where everybody's independent. And then what we do with those data are something like this. The idea is for each observer, front seat and back seat, we come up with a detection probability for horse groups of different attributes. So in this case, what I'm showing is we're trying to estimate the probability of a front seat observer detecting horse groups as a function of some horse attributes like group size. So let's say down here is low group size, 1, 2, 3 animals, and up here is bigger group sizes, 20, 30 animals at this end of the axis. So I have X's here showing cases where the front seat observer missed a horse group. So lots of misses down here where group size is low, less misses where it's up and where it's large. So it makes sense. You see groups that are larger more easily than groups that are small. And then these black circles are places where the front seat observer saw the horse group. And of course, that's happening more often for large group sizes than small group sizes. We get these data because the back seat observer was there too. So all those cases where the front seat observer missed, we only know about them because they were in the data set because the back seat observer must have seen them. Okay, so then what we do is we fit a model, and this curve kind of describes the function of how does the front seat observer, what's his probability of detecting horse groups as a function of group size. Now, in actuality, we do this for not only group size, but vegetative cover, the pilot's ability, a number of other variables all at the same time. But what we do is we get the front seat observer's detection probability, and we're trying to describe the detection probability for each horse group that got seen so we can correct for it. This is the last math slide, but I figure I've heard everybody does math best early in the morning, so I thought I'd indulge you. Basically, what we're doing is we're trying to get each group to have its overall detection probability estimated, so we can figure out how many more groups like it were out there that didn't get seen. If you figure out, after you've calculated the front seat observer's probability and the back seat observer's probability, you get this overall probability. I'm calling it P star, and we get a correction factor from it that's 1 divided by that P star. And so here's an example. Let's say you saw this group of 2 horses in heavy cover, a mile away from your flight line, so pretty low probability of detecting them. If you were going to repeat the survey, you would estimate that you'd only see them 1 in 3 times. Based on our earlier logic, if there's a 1 in 3 chance that we saw them this time, then there's a 2 in 3 chance that we missed them. So for every one that we see, there's 2 other groups like it that we missed. And that is just an assumption. That's the way that we approach it. So for every one group that we see like that, we assume that there were 2 others that we missed. So for those 2 we saw, they represent a total of 6 horses out there in the population. So that's really the approach and the logic. The math is a little more complex. What we do, we end up getting not only estimate, in this case the 6, but also we do some other processes to get a confidence interval. How certain are we that those 2 really represent 6? Maybe they represent 4, maybe they represent 8, and we come up with a confidence interval to tell us how confident we can be in our estimate when all is said and done. Here's some just example flight lines from this February's surveys, actually March, surveys in the Battle Mountain District. These areas, these heavy red boundaries are HMA or wild horse territory or herd area boundaries. And the faint lines that you can see are places where the helicopter traced its path across the landscape. And what I wanted to point out was, so this is a double observer method. While we're flying, we're counting horses. And you can see that in some areas, the flight lines are very closely placed together. Those are places where we, ahead of time, we decided they're forested. Let's make sure that the flight lines will be closer so that we have a good view down through the trees. Other areas, we had flight lines pretty far apart. Those are places where it's a large, wide open valley. We can be pretty confident that we'll see horses a mile or 2 out, so we can space our transects maybe 3 miles from each other. But the key thing is that we cover the area completely. So we're flexible. The specialists that I work with have a lot more experience than I do conducting surveys in the areas where they fly. So they know their areas, but what I try to bring is let's cover the area completely. Even though you know your areas, let's fly these places to be sure that there's nothing there. You think there's nothing there? That's great. Let's prove it. Yeah.
This is interesting, and it makes sense to me. When you're calculating the detection probabilities and something like that, do you also calculate your detection probabilities different in the PJ than you do out on the flat areas where you have different spacing on the flight lines?
So not specifically as a function of the flight line, but we record data that get at that. We record what's the distance from the helicopter flight line to the horse group. And so that's a measure that correlates with detection probability. And another is what's the vegetative cover density as a percentage around the horse group. So we try to capture that.
Okay.
But there's actually, no statistical method can really correct for everything. What we record data on are things that are known and make intuitive sense that they should affect detection probability, but there are always going to be a number of things that don't get quantified, and what we hope is that by collecting the data with all the things that we do know make sense, we'll capture most of what explains the detection probabilities.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
Do you set up your grids, a GPS grid, before you go out, before you leave the ground?
Yes, we do. And the process is kind of a back and forth. The specialists will send me their ideas of where they want to cover, wide or narrow. I'll look at them and we'll go back and forth. I'll say, well, let's tweak it here. They'll either I'll change it in GIS or they will with planning ahead. And then we convert those files to a format that the helicopter pilot can load into his GPS unit. And then that way the pilot is navigating. The pilot's main job is to navigate, fly safely. We all want to land and go home. Navigate, and the less that we have to worry about what the pilot is doing, the more we can look out the window. Yeah, so far we've had good success with the pilot loading it all up. That's one of our requirements now. Okay, well, the second method that is also approved in the same way, comparing estimates to what was known to be truth, is the photo mark recite method. And this is another form of kind of mark recapture analysis. But in this case, what we do is based on a number of transects over the same HMA many times. So the general idea is you go out, it's useful in small HMAs because it costs more. You have to repeat your surveys over the same land up to 6 times and record horses every time you fly over it. There also needs to be a lot of color variation in the herds for this to work. You have to be able to distinguish groups based on the color. It could be even small splashes of color on different body parts, but you have to be able to distinguish individual groups for this to work. So it's not going to work in a population where they're all bays or blacks. This method is more appropriate than double observer method that I talked about before in places where there might be a lot of tree cover or really heavy canyon topography. But it is more costly. Like I said, you have to survey the same area over and over again up to maybe 6 times. Every time you fly, if you detect a group, as soon as you detect a group, you circle around, you get a lot of good photographs of that group with a high-quality zoom lens, good enough that you can identify, yeah, that's the one with the white blotch on the pastern. That's that same group that we saw yesterday. You land, so you fly these surveys 6 times, then there's a very intensive period of time in the office where somebody has to match the photographs from each group, from each flight, and see which group was which and match them up. And what we're trying to get at, you're trying to get what we call a capture history. For each survey, was a group seen or not seen out of 6 surveys? So here's an example of flights in the Range Creek HMA from last year. This isn't my grandmother's knitting. It's supposed to be 6 different transects, each one a different color. So, for example, this yellow transect set, they flew the entire HMA. Every time they detected horses, they photographed them, then they landed. Then they came back a few hours or days later, and they flew the HMA a different way, maybe this light blue line. And these transect lines are not as close together as the double observer transect, where you just have one shot and you want to be sure to cover the whole area. In this case, you want to cover the area representationally each time you fly, but you can have more space between your transects. The goal in this is you're trying to develop a probability that each horse group gets detected on each set of transects. Just to show, here's an example. That same example, each color of dot represents horse groups that were seen on one set of transects. So all the yellow dots show places that were seen on that yellow set of transect surveys. Thank you. So then you develop this a data set that has the horses that were seen in each transect, and then based on their detections in each of those 6 sets, you get the detection rate per group, and you estimate the number of groups that were missed. So that's the last slide on the 2 methods that we're currently using. What we're doing now for our current workflow then is the state lead and district have their own discussions internally about which HMAs they want to survey in a given year. They contact the USGS to help with planning. And so I just have a dialogue with the specialist about the HMAs to be surveyed. What do they know about the patterns of where horses have been detected in the past? What can we say about how the flights should be flown this year? Then at some point, I go and either go in person or we do like a internet web-based training where I talk and train the staff that are going to be flying so that they know what data we're collecting and how. We have a draft of a working document for a training manual, and we're going to be improving that based on how this year goes. And then the BLM conducts the surveys. So, but if they request and would like my help, then I'll go out and either go in the helicopter or airplane with them, or be on the ground so that they can be the eyes in the sky, and then we can talk about it when they land. They enter the data and the district, and they verify it, which means they enter it into the computer once, they let it sit for a day, they come back with a fresh set of eyes, and they make sure that the data were entered from the paper sheets to the computer correctly. Then they send the data to me. I also review it and look for inconsistencies if there are any. We talk about them, clarify them. Then I send it to the statistician, Dr. Lubo. He does the estimation of population size. He and I talk about the data set also, so we're in consultation back and forth. When Dr. Lubo has got his estimate, he sends a draft of his memo to the district so that they can review it for inconsistencies. We have a discussion about what worked and what didn't, what lessons can be learned, what can be improved for the next year that HMA is surveyed. And then he finalizes his memo to them. Both the district, the BLM district, and I at USGS save all the files that are coming out of this analysis. And so the files that come out of this then are the planned flight lines, the actual flight lines, because as the pilot flies, he also records where we go. We have a separate GPS unit recording where we go because we always like to have a backup. If you're going to spend that kind of money, you want to know where you went. Points where we have a file for points where the animals were seen. Then we have the data file with all the observations. We have scanned copies of the paper data that were collected in the air. All of Dr. Lubo's analysis files and his memo. So it's kind of a lot of files for each survey, but taken together, they paint a complete picture of what was done for each survey. For right now, we're going to store them in the USGS's file storage and serving facility called Science Base. But eventually, the idea is that we'll be transitioning that back to the BLM in some way. So for now, we're just trying to upgrade the database, the file storage. We're working toward having a relational database for storing these data. Right now, it's all on Excel, which is not optimal, but that's what we've got for now. Okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about was just looking to the future. We've got, there are going to be some other things that we're trying to develop to improve aerial surveys. The first step is we'd like to test radio collars to be sure that we can have a design that's safe for horse neck wear. And if we can be sure of that and convince BLM that, yes, this is going to work in terms of a design that will not hurt animals and will fall off at a specified time, then just about every district that I've visited has been very enthusiastic to get GPS collars. It's got a lot of potential for informing where horses go year-round. These are like the units in your phone, but they record, where the horses are, maybe at specified time intervals. Another thing that we're trying to work on is using stratified sampling to reduce the area and the cost of surveys. The idea is if the specialist really knows, that is to say, thinks that here's the big HMA, but this area and this area and this area, you're never going to have horses. It's a salt pan. This is a mountain peak. This is a lake. We don't need to survey these areas. Well, what the approach we've taken so far is that's fine. Let's prove it. But the other approach that we could take is, all right, you identify those areas where you expect to have 0 horses or very few. That's fine. Let's sample a few subsets of those areas and prove that there are very few by randomly selecting some portion of those. Even if we can cut down on 10% or 20% of the total area being surveyed, at $1,000 or $1,200 an hour, that's a tremendous cost savings. The third thing is we're proposing to develop new techniques for burro surveys. Burros are completely their own animal. They stay still during surveys. They're harder to detect. And this is a case where having radio collars on burros could really help us improve our estimates. We've proposed to use DNA in non-invasive sampling from poop to estimate population sizes and genetic structure. And we have a new tool in the works to accurately measure distance from the helicopter to herds that you see. This is beyond a laser pointer because it incorporates height of the helicopter. And also, we've been asked maybe down the road to re-examine the use of forward-looking infrared, kind of a military tool that might be useful for finding horses on aerial surveys. And down the road, as the capabilities improve, maybe the use of drones. That would be attractive from a safety point of view. I didn't realize that I would speak so long, but there's as much time as you guys would like to ask questions.
John?
Yes, you provided a lot of very interesting information. My question is, on the collaring to identify these horses, what percentage of those horses do you think you'd have to collar in order to have an accurate count?
So if you were just going out to get historically what's been done with collars is you might put out a lot of collars and then count how many of those you saw again during the surveys. And if you're taking that approach, then you want to have a lot of collars on the order of 10-15% of the population. But the other approach that you can use with radio collars is, and this is work that I've done with elk in the Pacific Northwest, you can put a lot of radio collars out, actually a smaller number. But the idea is if you have radio collars on animals, you can do your survey, and every time you see any group of horses, you check to see whether it had a radio collar. Okay, well, then that way you have a record of what percentage of the ones you saw had the radio collars. Then you can, you kind of finish little subunits of your survey, and you turn on your radio detection device, and you find the ones that you missed. So then you go back, oh, okay, there it is. It was, and you record what the attributes of that group were. Oh, it was a group of 2. We got the collared animal, but it had a friend, and it was in heavy tree cover in this place. And you can say, oh, it was a half a mile from our transect. So you do that over and over again, and if you can build up, say, 80 cases or more, where you have these missed animals, you missed them during the visual part of your survey, but then you fly back and you find them because they have a collar on. then what you have is you develop a data set of what tended to be missed by both observers in the helicopter. And if you do that, then you can help to describe the probability function like we were looking at earlier as a function of things like group size and vegetative cover a lot more accurately than if you're just relying on the two observers. Because the problem with the two observers is there might be some categories of animals that get completely missed by both observers all the time, and then you can't account for those. They're always in deep cover, or they're always in sheer canyon walls. So, in fact, that's something I should say is well known that both of these methods, if anything, they tend to underestimate the true number of animals that are out there.
And then would you collar horses randomly, or would you, and you'd keep track of the sex of what was collared?
It's not necessary that they be randomly collared, but ideally they would be collared so that they become distributed in the population widely. And in terms of sex, I think we're leaning toward just trying this on mares because of stallions' neck growth from month to month, and also the really excessive fighting, and the fact that stallions and jacks also and burros can use the collar to the disadvantage of the wearer. They can grab it, bite it, pull. And
That seems more probable to collar the mares than the studs. I would agree with that.
That's right. And, the concern that some people would raise might be that if you're only collaring mares, you're not going to get an accurate representation of the stallions in the population. And that would be true if you're just doing the proportion of animals seen. But because what we would propose to do is the second method that I was talking about, where you build up a data set of animals that got missed and what the characteristics of their group were, it shouldn't matter that they're just on mares. In other words, a group of 3 horses standing in deep cover is probably just as likely to be seen if they're stallions or mares. It's not the sex of the animal that matters, it's the fact that there were 3 of them and they were standing in heavy vegetative cover. So that's where we'd like to take this into the future.
I know this counting these horses is a really difficult task. I've flown looking for cattle a lot, and I've flown right over areas where I'd see a half a dozen cattle, and I think there's got to be more than that there. And we'll pull up and turn around and fly it again and can't find the first 4 or 5.
That's right.
And so it gets pretty frustrating. You just know they're there, so you go look again, and you still don't see them. So I know it's difficult to get an accurate count.
It's tough, but that's the beauty of trying to quantify how bad we are at it. And then if you can do that, you can correct for it.
Callie?
So, thank you. Really, a lot of good information there. So, are you considering any other options to try to track them besides the collars, chips or anything like that as well?
Yes. Well, now this is just all in a proposal that we've made to get funded by BLM. But collars are, if we can get them to work, they would be the preferred method because they tend to have larger battery sizes, and so you can have a longer period of deployment. But we're also going to be trying, we're going to propose that we try also braiding in a GPS unit into either the mane, kind of right behind the ears, or if that looks not so promising, then on the tail, kind of about 2/3 of the way down the tailbone. That would probably have less rubbing than in the mane. But the idea is we would either braid or glue into the hair a GPS unit. You can't believe how small GPS units have become now for wildlife. You can have a 4-ounce unit that can collect a location on an animal every 20 minutes for 4 or 5 months. But as I said, the collar has a big benefit, not only the battery size, but it can, because of the large battery, you can transmit data out better. You can have a normal radio signal, so you can track animals that you are missing over 5-10 mile range. And a small unit braided into the tail may have good battery life, but it won't have a good radio out distance. But we're going to try it because collars might not work.
I have two questions. In the surveys that you have completed, have there been comparisons to what is estimated to be there currently? I mean, in the past? Has there been a significant increase or?
Well, I think that's the big motivation for using these methods, is that you can have an accurate measure over time. I haven't yet looked specifically at that question about whether there's been changes, or increases or decreases, but this is, I guess what the ideal comparison would be two surveys both using the same method, or some method that accounts for the number of animals not seen. And I haven't seen that yet.
Okay, and the second thing is, what happens when the collars no longer become useful?
So at that point, the key part of the design, any design that we'd be putting out, is a guarantee that they will drop off after a certain time period. Many manufacturers have a part of the collar where you can program them to drop off after whatever time period you want, a year, 2 years. And Dr. Peterson from in Utah, I think he's at BYU.
Brigham Young.
At Brigham Young, he came up with a very clever, I think, addition to that. Not only having the timed drop off, but having the surgical tubing, that kind of yellow tubing that's flexible. He and his students put some of that to tie the two ends of a collar together, and just exposure to the sunlight makes that material very brittle. And so I thought it was a very clever idea of his that by having that also tying the collar together, it's guaranteed that sunlight exposure will make that material break, and so that you can be sure that that collar will fall off after a year or two.
Thank you.
Tim?
Yes. The whole concept of doing this is intriguing. I think that, one of the questions I would seriously have is about the safety issue. I think is one of the main things, which you've, obviously, guys are putting a lot of thought into, of having a collar on a horse, a wild horse out there that, especially as referred to as far as, the stallions fighting and all that. I think focusing on the mares are more consistent presence in a band. How much thought in the tracking of the horses are you giving to being able to start correlating the movement and activities long-term of these bands, the horses, and then overlaying that on what seems to be with the multi-use of in herd management areas? There's a lot of discussion about a lot of the damage to these resources are being attributed to horse activity.
That's one of the big attractive.
But one of the things that intrigues me is that it seems like in a lot of places, the amount of horses is far less than the cattle presence, yet the horses are getting the blame for most of the range degradation because they're there for 12 months out of the year. What I see here is there's some the potential for clarification on how the horses are using the herd management areas. And I visited a lot of HMAs and met with a lot of BLM horse specialists that when I query them on how the horses are utilizing the HMAs as far as foraging and that kind of thing, they really don't understand. In fact, a lot of times what I'm told is that they're basically telling me that they think the horses are eating and using the range similarly to how the cattle use it. And as a horseman, I know that horses do use the range differently. So one of the things I see a big benefit of this is a clarification on how these animals are using the resources. And is that something that will be prioritized in these survey techniques, would be one question. I think the either gluing or braiding into the tail or something like that would be to me, would be a preferred way of attaching some kind of GPS unit, just because of the collar. I just see the collar as maybe being problematic, especially with stallions. But when you've got your stallion bands, how you know, I think it's important to you know, these little bachelor bands and stuff. I think being selective in how you collar and track these horses would give you some information that would be very valuable in ascertaining how they're utilizing the resources. You know, making sure that, you know, 1 or 2 mares in every band, making sure that you get at least, you know, a couple of them in bachelor bands if you can. You know, how you select and how you gather the horses in order to mark them is going to be a challenge, I understand, but this could really answer a lot of questions. And the other thing is, I don't know where transponder technology is today. I'm basically, I'm convinced that when the management of the Chincoteague herd, I convinced them to start going to using microchips. You know, and the difficulty with the microchips is that most of them were put up in the neck. And once again, horses fighting will break them, will break the chip. But you have to get close in order to identify the animal, and it's not a tracking device like a GPS is, but as far as going out and locating, I don't know if there's any long-distance transponder technology out there available to the public. I know there is for military use, but I don't know about that. And the FLIR stuff is the other one that intrigues me, and the difficulty with the FLIR obviously is that during the day it's not as effective as it is at night, which would require night flying. But FLIR with a drone would be really complete data. If they flew a good transect at night using FLIR, you would get a very, very accurate count of warm bodies, but how to differentiate between a large elk and a horse. But some of that can be, you know, with the wildlife folks and anecdotal, but you can also factor in that with, you know, if you factored that with daytime flights with observations, I think your data would be pretty complete. So, but anyway, very intriguing.
Thank you. As for your question about will surveys themselves be able to answer what resource use is? I think that something along the lines of a collar or a tag in the tail will do a much better job at that, because the data will be collected over many more days.
Well, having that ability to really see and look where they are, where they're going, and you know, knowing the resources of the HMA, you know, well, they're feeding now, you know, I mean, just, I think it'll, and then you, with on-the-ground observations of where degradation is or where issues are, it would maybe help in the management, on-range management. This would be an incredible tool to help on-range management. And you can identify that the areas of high use and that kind of thing, so, great.
I think in fairness now to the rest of the agenda, we'll probably shut up our questions from the board. And we thank you very much, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you.
And that was a very enlightening and valuable update. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Shade Research and Equine Responses to Hot Weather by Dr. Catherine Holcomb from UC Davis.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Is everything fine? Okay. Thank you for having me here. I met most of you last year when I came to talk about the CAWP. It's a complete coincidence that my doctoral dissertation work was on shade research, but I'm happy to be here and be able to talk to you about it. So this morning I'm going to go through how horses respond to hot weather, how they dissipate heat, and then I'll cover a few of the results from my shade research. Ooh, we skipped a slide. Okay, I know what happened. All right, I'm going to jump then. It jumped a slide, so I'll do this one and then go back to the other one. So horses, like all mammals, generate heat through metabolic processes, so internal heat, and they can also take on heat or give off heat to the environment. In order to maintain a normal body temperature, they need to balance that heat load, and they can do that through dissipating heat. So in hot weather, a horse normally will be giving off heat or dissipating heat, since that's what we're here to talk about. And they can do that in 4 ways. In conduction, heat moves between surfaces. So a horse lying on the ground, the heat will move from the horse's body to the ground if the ground is colder than the horse, and obviously the reverse is true if the ground is hotter. Heat moves through convection when there's air movement, and a typical good example is a cooling breeze. We normally think of radiation in terms of solar radiation, but heat is also dissipated from solid bodies through radiation, so horses can give off heat from their bodies. And then, of course, we're all familiar with sweat and evaporation through sweat. Horses are also able to dissipate heat through respiration, so when they expire that warm air, they're giving off some of that body heat. And heat always moves from the higher to lower temperatures. So now we're going to go back 1 slide. I'll just leave it there. So horses use all of these methods to dissipate heat, and their responses can be categorized in 2 ways: physiological responses and behavioral responses. So physiologically, they can increase respiration rate. They can increase blood flow to the skin. That moves the very warm blood from the central core to the surface for dissipation. We already talked about sweat. Behaviorally, they can turn their rumps to the sun. That shades the rest of their bodies. They can move into the shade or into a cooling breeze. They will remain standing rather than lying down. Again, the ground can become very hot in hot weather, and so they'll remain standing. There's much less surface area on their hooves to conduct any heat. They may stand near in water. They'll drink more water to remain hydrated, and they may eat less feed because digestion generates metabolic heat. So now we're going to have to jump over this one. It's not moving. Okay, it's going. Okay. So now we'll talk about how those different responses come into play and when they come into play. And when we're looking at thermoregulation, we can look at temperature zones, and I'll orient you to this slide. So I have, where is it? On the x-axis, the horizontal axis, I'm showing ambient temperature. On the y-axis, or the vertical axis, where did my dot go? I'm showing internal body heat production, so that's that metabolic heat rate, and we measure that using rectal temperature. And then I'm showing 4 heat zones, what's called a thermoneutral zone, a warm zone, a hot zone, and an intolerably hot zone. So in the thermal neutral zone, a horse at rest, so a horse just hanging out, he might be grazing, he might be just dozing. That horse is using only the amount of energy it needs for maintenance. It doesn't need any extra energy to maintain that core body temperature. And this blue line here shows body temperature. I'll be showing that as we go through these slides. As ambient temperature increases, the horse will begin to use energy. And in the warm zone, the responses are going to be passive responses. So this is where we see that increased blood flow to the skin, increased drinking, decreased eating, and then the different behavioral responses.
Dr. Holcomb,
Yes.
what would you define the upper end of your thermal neutral zone?
Hold that question, please.
Okay.
So at this point, the horse is still maintaining that body temperature, the normal body temperature. And normal body temperature for a horse is 99.5 to 101.5 degrees, just for reference. Average about 100.5. As ambient temperature increases to the hot zone, the horse will need to use even more energy, and now he begins to use active responses. So this is where we see increased respiration rate, increased heart rate, sweat. These processes, as they're using energy, causes more internal heat production. So rectal temperature may begin to go up. In this zone, the horse is still maintaining that normal range, though. So he's still within the range. It may be increasing, but it's not above normal. And then as ambient temperature gets even hotter, we reach what's called the upper critical temperature. At this point, the horse is using all those thermal regulatory mechanisms. It's, you know, all hands on deck, basically. And you'll see they may reduce activity in order to prevent, you know, to reduce some of that metabolic heat load, and so we see a little plateau there. Once the horse goes beyond upper critical temperature, the horse is now in danger. If there's no relief, if the horse is not cooled off, the thermoregulatory mechanisms can become overwhelmed. The horse will lose control of being able to regulate body temperature. And you get into an upward spiral where the horse tries to be more active to control it. That generates more internal body heat. It becomes more active. It's an upward spiral. If that spiral isn't stopped, death may occur. And so now we'll get to your question, which should be the burning question. What are these environmental temperatures? At what point does each of these things happen? And I would love to be able to give you some numbers, but that's not possible. The answer is it depends. And it depends on a lot of different factors. Looking first at the weather factors, we ask what's the humidity? 90 degrees at 20% humidity in Sacramento is a much different environment than 90 degrees and 75% humidity in Florida. Is there a breeze? Is there any wind? What's the level of solar radiation? Is it high, or is there a cloud cover? Is there shade? And what's the duration of the heat? Is it a couple hours during the afternoon? Is it all day long? Is it a couple of days in a row, or is it a week or 10 days? These all have a big effect on how the horse accumulates heat and how he's able to dissipate heat. And then another really important factor is nighttime cooling. How much does the temperature drop during the nighttime? If you have hot days and cool nights, the horse can eliminate a lot of that accumulated heat, essentially resetting itself for the next day. If the nighttime remains high, the recovery isn't as effective, and they'll carry some of that heat load into the next day. So these are all the it depends factors for weather. And then we look at the horse, and we have to ask, what's the horse's body type, the size, the age, the health, disease? Is he injured? Does he have some kind of condition that is compromising? What's the horse's fitness level, the body condition? Is this a slim horse or a very heavy horse? What's the coat color? What's the skin color beneath the coat color? How long is the horse's hair? What kind of diet is it on? Some feeds generate more heat than others when they're digested. Is the horse accustomed to the climate? So a horse moving here today from Michigan is going to be pretty hot, but the horses that live here are fine, right? Is the horse at rest or exercising? What kind of ground is it on? Is it bare dirt, sand, grass? Is he standing on pavement? Is the horse stabled or turned out? Is it housed alone or in a group? Are we talking about a pregnant mare here? And then does the horse have access to water to remain hydrated? That's always an important factor. So as an example, let's look at these two horses. The horse on the left has a very light body, long, slim legs, and a slick hair coat. The one on the right is very heavy in the body and the legs, has longer hair and just a whole lot more hair, a lot of feathering there. These two horses on the same day in the same paddock may be trotting next to each other. The horse on the left may be in the thermoneutral zone, not having to expend any extra energy to maintain its body temperature. But the horse on the right may be using active mechanisms to maintain body temperature. It may be in the hot zone. So on the same day and the same ambient temperature. So it depends is the answer to your question. So I've gone through how horses dissipate heat, what the methods are, and shown you that there's kind of a gradual increase in the methods that they employ to maintain body temperature. This has been extensively studied in horses undergoing strenuous exercise, especially in hot, humid weather. This was done in advance of the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta. A great deal of research was done then because they knew it would be very hot and humid, and they knew that they would need to know what they could do to prevent the horses from reaching that intolerably hot zone. So they looked at a lot of factors and a lot of management practices. Horses do show a high tolerance for heat, much higher than humans do. So there was extensive research on exercising horses, but there's very limited research on horses at rest. And that's one reason why I did my research on shade use, so choosing one factor. So first, let's look at what is shade. So the temperature that we perceive, so what we perceive how hot we are, is a combined effect of ambient temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, precipitation, and solar radiation. One of the things that I'd never thought about before doing this research is ambient temperature is the same whether you're standing in the sun or you're in the shade. It's solar radiation that makes us feel so much hotter because our bodies absorb solar radiation as heat. So shade blocks that solar radiation and decreases our perceived temperature. So for my shade research, I looked at two different questions. The first was, do domestic horses benefit from shade? And I take a step aside here and remind you that this research had nothing to do with the BLM. This was domestic horses. Okay. So in the first study, I measured the physiology and behavior of domestic horses that were housed either in 100% shade or 100% sun. So the horses on the left are in corrals that were completely covered by it was an open-sided shade structure, so they were shaded all day long. The horses on the right were in pens that had no shade from trees or structures or anything, so they were in the sun. This slide is going to show some of the average weather conditions that we recorded in the afternoons during that study. Remember, the two treatments are completely shaded or completely in the sun, and you can see right off the bat how much difference shade makes in solar radiation. Solar radiation is measured in watts per meter squared. It's a measure of energy. This is not temperature, but you can see there's a dramatic difference. And when we look at ambient temperature, this shows what I said, that it's the same, pretty much the same whether you're in the sun or the shade. And I show average ambient temperature and then our maximum temperatures that we saw. And I mentioned previously that the ground can become very hot in hot weather, and that's borne out here. The temperature of the soil, these horses were on a dirt, the soil was almost 45 degrees greater in the sun than it was in the shade. Now we'll look at a couple of the measurements that we took, rectal temperature, respiration rate, skin temperature, and sweat score. The values were greater, significantly greater for horses in the sun for all of these measures. Looking at sweat, for example, horses in the shade rarely showed any sweat at all, whereas horses in the sun were observed to be sweating in more than half the observations. Are these horses in any danger? No, look at the rectal temperature. They are significantly different, but those are well within the normal range. So these horses, the horses in the sun were using active mechanisms. They were, the respiration rate was increased. They were sweating, but they're still maintaining their normal body temperature. My second question asked if shade is available to domestic horses, will they use it? I can't tell you how many friends and people have said, I built this shade structure out there for my horse, and at the hot time of the day, he's standing out there in the sun, and on not. So this question was to look at that. And in this study, we used pens that were half covered by an open shaded structure, so the pen was 50% shaded, 50% in the sun. We used one horse in each pen. The horse was able to move freely back and forth from the sun to the shade. Here we are. You can see this horse is half and half. That horse actually liked to take his naps there. He was half and half during his naps every afternoon. So what we recorded was how much time they spent in each side. And what we found was the overall shade use was 57.1%. So in 57.1% of the observations, the horses were in the shade. In this kind of study, because a horse in these pens moving randomly could be in the shade half the time just by chance, because it's 50% covered in shade. So to accurately characterize this, we subtract that 50%. And what we say is that the horses use the shade in 7.1% more observations than would be just by chance. So that shows a preference of 7.1%. Does that make sense? Okay. Then a third study that I did used small groups of horses to ask if they would also use shade. In this case, there were much larger pens. We had 3 horses in each pen. You can see on the left side, that's what the shade structure looked like. Again, these are open-sided shade structures. And we had 4 pens at a time. So there were, 4 pens were being studied each time. What we found in this one was average, so the overall shade use was 7.1%. This study used a completely different methodology than the other one, than the one on the previous slide, so we can't do the subtract chance. And if you want to know more, I'll tell you later why that is. But the point of this is to show you that their average shade use was much, much less than those individually housed horses. And what we observed was that the horses spent a lot of time chatting with each other across the fence. The photo on the right shows where the 4 pens came together. All 12 horses are standing there in that photo. So what this tells us is that socialization might be a much bigger factor to them than shade. They'd rather hang around and talk to each other than stand in the shade. We also noticed that when they did use the shade, they tended to go all 3 of them over there. Rarely did we see one horse over in the shade. So there's very much a herd dynamics factor here that would need to be researched more if someone would like to do that. So what did we conclude from the studies? The first question was, do horses benefit from shade? Yes, they benefit. The horses in the sun were required to use those active responses. The horses in the shade didn't. I am using the word benefit. I will not use the word require, okay? If shade is available, will horses use it? Yes, we saw that they did. However, there could be some social factor involved. I've provided each of you with, the first 2 studies have been published, and I've given you the papers, the publications, so if you want to get into the gory details, you've got those there. Now, a final consideration is that horses with compromised health are likely to receive a greater benefit from shade than the mature, healthy horses that we used in this study. So that concludes my presentation, and at this point, I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions? Excuse me, any questions from the board?
Yeah, I got a couple. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you.
That's one.
Hey, that's one. I know you and I spoke a little bit yesterday, and I promise I wouldn't beat on you today. But I guess my question is, I know you were, this comes to a question of whether shade's required or not required is really what it came down to, is what the BLM was trying to determine. I guess my viewpoint on it from I think it demonstrates very clearly that if horses have the option to have some shade, that when they're uncomfortable, they'll use it. That's a pretty good statement. Okay.
Yes.
And I know that myself, the vet practice that I studied with for 3 years, one of the main things we treated was overheating issues in horses with anhydrosis. And that anecdotally, and I'm not a doctor here by any means, but so I may need some help here, but it seemed that one of the things that caused the anhydrosis condition in a lot of the horses was getting overheated in the first place. That the horses that had a difficult time thermoregulating were the ones that ended up with anhydrosis. And the shade aspect was pretty important for them.
And these were horses that had been exercised.
Correct. They had been exercised. Most of the
Right.
horses we were treating were performance horses,
Right.
race horses, things like that.
Right.
But I guess what it really comes down to for me is if horses have the option to use it when they get uncomfortable, that shade can be very beneficial to them in thermoregulation. In the same way as getting out of the wind, because of the wind, where the heat goes to the cold. That wind, that's why wind chill is so important. I mean, I've spent a good part of my life up in the Northeast where we have really severe winter conditions, and 20 below zero, and you can be 0, but with 35-mile-an-hour winds, and you've got a wind chill of 25 below zero.
Right.
So, in the whole process of thermoregulation and all this, was how important or how much of a factor would you attribute to wind conditions, for instance, in this process in conjunction with the shade as a factor of thermoregulation?
It is definitely a factor. It's not something that I can give you a how much of a factor.
It's important though.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is important. And I might point out the horses with anhydrosis would fall into that category of horses that had compromised conditions.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And the other thing that I was very intrigued by was the social.
Yes.
The social part, because
Yes.
I know I see
We
it.
were too.
No, I see it in my horse. I have the unique situation where I spend part of the year in Florida and part of the year in New Hampshire. So I'm up in this really cold weather, and then I have to take my herd of horses, and my horses travel with me. I take my 4 horses and go to Florida with them. And in Florida, they spend a lot of time in the trees. Up in New Hampshire, they're out in they find the funny, sunniest spot they can find.
They probably want the heat when they're up
Right.
north, yeah,
But they're out of the wind.
yeah.
We have, that their primary concern in the cold weather is staying out of the wind and in the sun. And down south, it's staying out of the sun. So, anyway, that's it, thanks.
Dr. McDonald.
Following up on the social motivation to be out of the shade, you might have said this and I missed it, but where were you feeding these animals in relation to the shade?
In that study, we fed them before we began observations so that it was not under the shade. That's one reason why we couldn't call it a preference test, because it was not under the shade. Yeah. We didn't feed, the previous study where the horses were individually housed, we separated the feed so they had the same amount of feed in the sun and the shade, the same amount of water in the sun and the shade. And this other study, we didn't do that, so that is a factor. We didn't expect the social factor. We hadn't thought of that. And if we were to do it differently, we would. These were anecdotal, basically, observations. We didn't record how much time they spent together. And if I were to do it again, I would look at that much more in depth, definitely.
Thank you.
Callie, did you have a question?
I do have a quick question. And so I guess as I'm looking at these two, if I'm understanding the percentages and comparing, so what you consider that much, but I'm seeing 7.1% of the time in both studies that they would use shade
And
versus.
that's a coincidence that it's the same number.
Well,
Because they're completely different methodology.
okay.
They can't really be compared. It's
Okay.
apples and oranges.
But I guess I'm thinking that they are completely different, and yet you still see that that's about the about the number.
It's
percent.
It's just apples and oranges, yeah.
Help me understand that. Somewhere I'm missing something, I guess.
Well, the methodology, as I was just saying to Dr. McDonald, in the study with the individually housed horses, we made sure that each side had,
Right.
the resources were equal.
Okay.
And you have to do that to be able to subtract chance, to understand that the only difference there is the shade. In the other study, the amount of shade was smaller. We didn't have feed and water equally in both places. The feed and water were out in the sun, basically. So we can't calculate that difference from
Okay.
chance.
Okay, so
It's
I
not-
guess that maybe I was what I'm saying and what I'm thinking may not be connecting here. So in the individual horse studies, about 7% of the time they have a preference one way or the other.
Right, they showed a 7.1%
Okay.
preference, greater than chance.
And that's 7 times out of 100, right? That they would do that.
It's 7% more than chance. So out of 100, it's 57.1%. But it's,
Somebody-
If I understand it right, in the trial where you have individual horses and you knew that half the opportunity was to be in the shade and half
Right.
the opportunity was in the sun,
Right.
57% of the time they were in the shade.
correct,
And 43% of the time they were in the sun.
correct.
But in the other trial, 7% of the time they were in the shade, 93% of the
Right.
time they were in the sun.
Right.
Right.
Does that help?
Yeah,
So
but I
the-
guess in either case, I guess I'm not seeing that they are seeing it extremely important
Oh,
to be
okay.
in the shade, I
Okay.
guess is
That's
what.
your- that's your point. Okay,
From
sorry.
a horse's
Sorry, I didn't know where you were
perspective,
going there.
okay, so
Okay.
if I'm only gonna go over there 7% of the time, that's not overly important to me, I guess is the way that I would be looking at it if I was putting myself on their shoes, I guess I'll say. So, okay, that kind of helped me understand that.
I think we're looking at a minor increase or preference over just, it's not an overwhelming preference to be in
Right,
shade.
right.
I think maybe is,
They weren't there 100% of the time on the hot part of
Yeah.
the day, yeah.
okay. Dr. Cope?
Thanks, Boyd. I was going down the same road. I've got really nice p-values on all your physiological data, but we come to the behavioral measures, and I see no p's. Was there a value attached to that 7.1% preference, and how large or small was it?
Yes, there was a significantly, the preference was significant, yes. I'm not sure I'm following what your question is.
Well, I'm just.
Are you looking
I
at the
didn't-
paper? Or
Yeah, I was looking at the paper, and I didn't find a p-value
It's in it.
relating to the behavioral measures. That's why I wondered what the
The-
statistical significance was on it.
If you're looking at the paper, the behavior measures are like where they were standing next to water. Is that what you're looking at, or just?
Well,
the-
I'm
the-
basically talking about the 7%
okay,
increase.
That p-value is in the text, and it's less than .05. Off the top of my head, I don't know what it is.
I
but
couldn't
but
find
it's-
it looking through, that's why I was
It's,
asking.
it's less than .05.
Okay, in fairness to the other presentations, I think we may want to shut this down, or as far as questions. Dr. Holcomb, will you be available through lunch and stuff in case some of the board members have
Yes,
questions?
absolutely.
Thank you.
I got one quick question, then I'll leave it. Do you have horses?
Yes.
Do you have shade for your horses?
I'm at a boarding stable, yes, she has a stall and a pen.
I'm just wondering if you provide shade for your horses?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Holcomb.
Thank you. Just asking, she's the expert on this, and I simply asked her.
Okay. Next, we're going to have thermal profile assessments by Dr. Al Kane, and I guess just Al. Welcome, Dr. Kane.
Good morning. This morning I'm going to share just a brief kind of description of another tool we're going to bring into play to kind of help examine some of the shade issues in the facilities. And this is a little project that, it's not a research project, it's just an assessment that we put together as part of a collaborative effort with the horse program and with the APHIS-BLM partnership, which is what I coordinate, and then a branch of, I'm with Veterinary Services, whoops. And then we also used a branch of APHIS, which is the Center for Animal Welfare in Kansas City. And this center was established in the fall of 2010. It serves as a resource for science and technology support of policy development and analysis for animal welfare. And it also serves as a center for technology transfer and science transfer into the regulatory aspects of that APHIS has in other areas. Typically, this center provides best practice advice to federal, state, and local agencies and other stakeholders on the safety and the well-being of animals, using the latest in animal welfare science and technology to help with the analysis of animal care policies. This is a relatively new endeavor for APHIS, and it's been very successful in different areas, including, for example, anti-soaring regulation and bringing more advanced science into those regulatory aspects. The center director that I'm working with is Dr. Nora Weinland, who I worked with previously in Veterinary Services. And then Dr. Von Langman is a field specialist in biophysics. He's actually the scientist that has the expertise in this area of thermal profile assessment. He has a PhD in physiology with a focus in his studies in thermal regulation, and he has experience with the management and welfare of exotic and wildlife species in both field settings in Africa as well as in captive settings, such as zoological parks and game parks. So the objectives of this little project are to evaluate the summertime thermal profiles of different colored horses and burros in a typical BLM holding facility in the western United States. This will be done in the middle of the summer during peak times for solar radiation, and it includes measuring and evaluating solar radiation, both direct and reflected. It also measures the amount absorbed by an animal's hair coat and quantifies the effects of solar heat on the animal. Basically, they measure all heat gained from solar radiation and then the heat lost through reflected radiation and radiative heat in the environment, both directly and indirectly. And they can do this in the sun and in the shade. And then potentially, depending on the shade structures available, we can take the same measurements within the shade structures, same measurements from the animals, same measurements from the environment, again, measuring both direct solar radiation as well as reflected radiation in the environment. And to get a better idea how shade can be used and if shade is needed to reduce heat loads during the middle of the day during these hot times of the year, and how it might help the animals maintain a normal thermal profile and or prevent problems associated with overheating. As I said, basically, he's going to take a bunch of measurements of the animals. These are all non-invasive measurements. They measured the absorbance of the hair coat in the sun on different colored animals because it varies depending on the coat color potentially. Measure the insulation properties of the hair coat. Measurements within the thermal zone in the environment at different times of the day and night. So that includes reflected heat off the ground, off other structures in a pen. And then this whole assessment is going to be adjusted depending on what we find, during our investigation, during different options of looking at shade or not. We may go to some different facilities. We're going to start at Palomino Valley, I think, in July and see where it goes from there. And we may expand to some other facilities or other times a year. And I'm not an expert in biophysics. I'm not an expert in this aspect of it. That's why we hire an actual biophysicist or engineer to take these measurements. So, as I said, this is very much a collaborative effort. I'm kind of the guy that's coordinating the on-the-ground part with BLM. And so I'm learning as I go how this is going to be useful and how to interpret it. The methodology itself is pretty well established. It's been used in zoologic parks and game parks to help them with the design of their housing and display areas. It's been done on different species, including Przewalski's horses, yaks, giraffes, sea otters, etc. It's also been done, I think, extensively with elephants. As I said, all these measurements are non-invasive. We expect to spend 2 or 3 days at the facility, and then after that, there'll be some time for data analysis and modeling. This is not a extended sort of research project. This is a go in, take some measurements for a few days, go home, analyze it, and write it up kind of a project. The final product will be a report to BLM describing the findings, the thermal profiles, and the potential effects of shade under these conditions for these animals. It may include recommendations on the use of shade in BLM facilities, and it'll just be one more tool or one more piece of information to evaluate the potential effects of shade. I don't expect this to be a definitive end-all answer to the issue or question, but I think it will help shed light on how shade may or may not be useful in a facility. And the goal here is obviously to provide the best possible care for wild horses and burros in BLM's care. The strength of this approach is that it's based on objective, non-invasive measurements, and we're going to measure actual horses in an actual corral environment. It involves measurements, calculations, processing the data, and then writing it up. It's nice that it's a relatively quick and easy thing. This isn't a research project that's going to take 3 months, 6 months, or a year. I expect from start to finish, it'll be probably 30 days. The limitations are that there are assumptions here. Some of this does become theoretical when you just look at the sources of heat in the system, sources of heat out of the system, and calculations to look at the difference. So there are assumptions. Like any modeling effort, it depends on the data you put into it and what assumptions you make. And if there's any questions, I'll try to answer them. Just bear with me and know that I'm not the biophysicist here, and I'm kind of learning how this tool is going to be helpful to us as we go. Yes?
Well, you have a rough idea of estimated cost?
It's a good question. It's essentially, I'm already paid for, so my role in this doesn't cost anything extra. I think we'll pay for the travel for probably 2 people plus myself to go out. It takes a couple of people to do the measurements because somebody's got to hand stuff to the other guy that's doing the measuring. I think we're going to end up paying for Vaughn's time and salary. just at sort of a regular day rate. So again, if we're out there for 3 days and he spends 5 days writing it up, you know, I'm just guessing here, but I think we're gonna pay a couple of weeks worth of salary for one guy and travel for 3 people from the Midwest to Nevada. So if it costs more than $5,000, $6,000, I'll be surprised.
Thanks.
It's not something that we're gonna, you know, it's not a fee-for-service thing where there's a big budget involved. It's basically just covering expenses.
Thank you.
Al, can you tell me what kind of non-invasive actual measuring equipment, or how are you acquiring that data?
Well, and again, this is the best of my understanding, but he has ways of measuring long and shortwave radiation, and it depends, there's a standard, which is a certain color of cloth that the absorbance is known, and then that's compared to the coat of the horses. So he measures the radiation coming off the sun, he measures the absorptive properties of what the radiation is hitting, and that includes the horse, the environment, and then he has a way of measuring the reflected radiation off the horse and off the environment. And beyond that, I don't.
And he's able to do it at some distance, I assume, then?
Actually, you have to be hands-on. You have to be, some of it you have to lay the cloth on the horse, you have to be within a few feet, and it takes like a couple of minutes of being right on top of the horse. And I think what we're probably gonna end up doing, because I'm trying to figure out how well this is gonna work, is we may actually use either gentled horses at the facility or a domestic horse that we know will stand still, but in the facility. So what I need to do, I think, is come up with a, 3 different color of horses. So we have either a light colored horse, a bay, a sorrel. We're not all measuring bay horses or all gray horses or whatever. But whether it's a saddle horse or a gentled Mustang, I don't think is really gonna matter too much. It's gonna be the same type horse, the, colors that sort of represent one extreme to the other. And then we're gonna do it in the corral facility because part of the measurements are of the environment. You can't do it all out in the parking lot because the horses don't live in the parking lot.
Well, and that's what I was wondering, because if you have to get hands-on and put them through the facility, there'll be some metabolic increase and.
Yeah, and I don't think we can do it in a chute. I think the chute itself is gonna interfere with, the sun and the radiation plus the heat coming off the chute and that sort of thing. So it's not like we can just stand them in the chute and do it.
Okay.
That's part of what, he's done this in zoos, he's done it with, wildlife species, and some of those are trained to stand still. They're specifically trained to allow people to take kind of non-invasive measurements. And I know he's done it with wildlife in zoos. So I'm sure he'll have some ideas also about how we might be able to do it with the animals as little disturbance as possible.
Dr. McDonald, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, what facility are you gonna do the study at?
I think the first sort of run is going to be at Palomino Valley.
Oh, okay, I just think like Carson City or one of the places at the prison program where the horses are gentled and easier to handle might be something to put in the thought process. Might be,
Yeah, I think.
Because it doesn't matter what horse it is, and I think the other consideration to think about is what Dr. Halcomb had mentioned, that one of the factors in her paper was skin color as well.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, I did some checking, and there's at least half a dozen saddle horses at Palomino Valley at any time. Obviously, we'll have to check, make sure they're not clipped or they're not, they haven't sort of been brushed out at that time of year. They should all be slicked out pretty much in the same manner, but that's something we'll have to look into.
Any other comments, questions from the board? Dr. Kane, thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, we're a little ahead of time, so I'm going to leave it to our facilitator to
Yeah,
tell us
I
how we're gonna
just
handle it.
wanted to raise, thank you, Al. I just wanted to raise the possibility, if you had questions from the previous 2 speakers that you didn't have an opportunity to present, either Paul Griffith or Catherine Holcomb, there was something you were trying to get in and we moved you on too fast.
Did we rush through and someone missed the opportunity to, go ahead.
I had one other question for Dr. Holcomb concerning rolling behavior. I know that you measured it. I didn't, quickly looking through your paper, I didn't see if you had a result on the rolling behavior, which could,
Come on up, please, because we won't be able to hear you. Thank you.
and you might comment to the group on the importance of rolling behavior to thermoregulation.
Okay, then, rolling behavior for thermoregulation, horses can get more dirt on them, which can be protective, and it could block the radiation and also reflect some of that radiation back out, so it could keep them cooler. We saw so little rolling behavior that we weren't able to analyze it. There weren't enough instances of it to run statistics on.
And what
So-
was the substrate? Was it a
It was-
loose,
it-
sandy?
It was loose dirt,
Mhm.
yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
There, Dr. Holcomb, was there, were there any, during your study, how often would you say there were extremely hot conditions? Is that in there? I mean, you notated conditions every day, but
Right.
how many days did you have extreme heat or extreme conditions
Oh,
in order, because, I mean, we're looking at thermoregulation in horses, and
Right.
to me, it's the issue of thermoregulation is under extreme conditions. That's where you see where the problems are.
Right.
And so if it's, 85 to 100 degrees every day and sunny, and there's a little bit of shade there and everything else, that can push things around a little bit. But to me, what would be important to see is how would the study run if you were in a place with really extreme conditions? Highly reflective surfaces, cloudless skies, high temperatures, windless days, things like that. I'm just curious, did you have any extreme conditions in your study?
At one time, I could have told you exactly how many days above 100 it was. I don't remember now, but it was less than half were above 100. I actually got some of the coolest summers in ages in Davis. And that's one reason why studies need to be replicated in other places.
Yeah, because, I mean, to me, what's important, for this data to really resonate with the issues that the BLM has with this, that a study like this, to me, would carry more weight in making decisions in regards to keeping horses in holding facilities with the BLM if they were conducted in the conditions that those horses are being held in. I mean, it's like, well, anyway, I don't need to
I
be on this
can
anymore.
tell you the conditions in Davis and at Palomino Valley are very, very similar.
Yeah, okay.
So,
Okay, well, that answers part of it. Thank you.
In fact, I would say because of the difference in elevation, they would be a little more extreme down here than at Davis than they would be at the higher elevation north of Reno.
possibly, yeah.
Any other questions for Dr. Holcomb? Okay, thank you again.
You're welcome.
Then unless you have any business you'd like to conduct, you may have just earned yourself an extra 5 minutes on your break. Oh, we have someone, sorry.
I had a question for Paul. There have been, radio collar surveys and things in the past. I know that my organization participated in one, and I just wondered if you had access to any of that data.
I don't think that I've seen it for horses or burros yet, but I'd be very glad to look at that.
I can't remember offhand exactly when it was. I know it was at least 10 years ago or so.
I'm going to come out to Cedar City in a few weeks, so
Oh, I'd be
We could try
glad,
to
I'd be
talk then.
happy to talk to you if you do that.
okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Dr. Griffin? If not, we'll take that break. We'll be back here at 10:15. Thank you.